Hi, this is George with 573 Medicine. In this video, we're going to be going over the integument system. So let's get started. The integument system is the outermost layer of the human body, consisting of the skin, which is our largest organ, as well as related structures. Just a brief overview, this is the skin, so this is superficial. You can see your skin with your naked eye, as well as hairs coming out of your skin, and this is deep. So there are three layers of the integument system: the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. So the epidermis is going to contain pigment or melanin, as well as immune cells. The dermis is going to contain nerve endings, sweat glands, and hair follicles. And the hypodermis is going to consist mostly of fat and connective tissue, as well as blood vessels. So this is an H&E slide of the skin. We have the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis from superficial to deep. The epidermis contains 4 or 5 layers, depending on whether or not you have thick skin or thin skin. Thick skin is found on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet, and contains the Stratum Corneum, Stratum Lucidum, Stratum Granulosum, Stratum Spinosum, and Stratum Basal from superficial to deep. Thin skin would not have the Stratum Lucidum, so it would go from Stratum Corneum to the Stratum Granulosum, and thin skin is found everywhere except for the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. The dermis contains the papillary layer and the reticular layer from superficial to deep. So papillae means finger-like projections. Reticular layer would be deep. And then the hypodermis contains fat and blood vessels. So thick skin, as I mentioned before, is found in the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet, and thin skin is found everywhere else. It's actually really hard to tell based entirely on H&E, but here is a H&E of thin skin and a thick skin trichrome stain. Something else that may be worth noting is that we can see the stratum lucidum right here, and it's actually a pretty thin layer. But thick skin is actually thick because all of the layers of skin are thicker, not because of the extra stratum lucidum layer. So here's an H&E of the skin. So we have the stratum corneum, which is consisting of actually dead cells, anuclear dead cells. So notice there's no basophilic staining of the stratum corneum. Stratum granulosum, we start getting those nucleated cells. So this is a flatter, more squamous layer. Then we have the stratum spinosum, which is the largest layer of the epidermis, which also contains squamous cells. And then we have the stratum basal. So the stratum basal, these cells are actually cuboidal, and they're attached to the basement membrane, which separates the epidermis from the dermis. So in the basement layer, we have these melanocytes that produce melanin, which is the pigment, and transfers the melanin to keratinocytes that are more superficial. Additionally, keratinocytes divide in the stratum basal and produce keratin, which is an important protein in skin function. So this is another picture of the skin with all of the layers labeled. We can see the basement membrane right here, as well as these other epidermal cells. So they could be melanocytes, or they could be Merkel cells, which are types of mechanoreceptors. And we can see keratinocytes labeled here, and these are our cells which produce keratin. Here is a different stain showing Langerhan cells, which are a type of dendritic cell or immune cell found in the epidermis. You won't be able to see them on H&E, but many disease processes involve Langerhan cells, so it's worth mentioning here. So now that we've zoomed in on the epidermis, let's zoom in on the dermis. And remember, the dermis has, from superficial to deep, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. H&E slide of the papillary and reticular dermis. So in this picture, we can appreciate the papillae, which is the more superficial layer, and then we have the reticular dermis, which is more deep. And so it's actually kind of difficult to appreciate on this magnification, but we can see that the papillary layer has these finger-like papillae projections, and it actually is consisting of loose connective tissue, whereas the reticular dermis is dense connective tissue, and it's also irregular. So you can see the fibers of the reticular dermis going in many different directions. So now that we've zoomed in on the dermis, let's zoom in on the hypodermis. So the hypodermis is primarily going to be consisting of fat. You can also see some blood vessels in this area. So there are also other structures of the skin that we are going to see. So we have hair follicles, the erector pili muscle, which contracts and brings your hair up whenever it's cold outside. We also have the neurovasculature, as well as glands. So there are sebaceous and sweat glands. So sebaceous glands and sweat glands. And so sebaceous glands are going to be near hair follicles, and they're going to secrete a lipophilic sebum. And sweat glands are going to be divided into two parts: the apocrine or eccrine sweat glands. We also have mechanoreceptors. So we have these Meissner's corpuscles, which are involved in light touch and more superficial. We have Pacinian corpuscles, which are involved in deep touch or high frequency vibration. And so anatomically, we can see these Pacinian corpuscles, which kind of look like onions, are deeper than Meissner's corpuscles. So it should make sense if you understand the anatomy that the Meissner's corpuscle is going to be light touch, whereas the Pacinian corpuscle is going to be deep touch. We also have what are called Ruffini's corpuscles, and these are going to be stretch receptors. And so this is just a zoom up of apocrine and eccrine sweat glands. It's important to see that apocrine sweat glands have a wide lumen, whereas eccrine sweat glands have a narrow lumen. Additionally, we have these sebaceous glands next to a hair follicle that secrete the lipid-rich sebum. This is another picture of a sebaceous gland where you can actually see the erector pili muscle, as well as the lumen of the hair follicle. This is an example of Meissner's corpuscle and the papillary dermis, which is more superficial. And this is a better picture where you can actually see that it's loose connective tissue, so you can see a lot of that watery substance. This is a picture of this pack is Pacinian's corpuscles. They kind of look like the onion, and these are involved in deep touch.